Good afternoon and welcome to this webinar, Israel-Palestine War Perspectives from the Caribbean. We are organizing this seminar as a joint activity by the Institute of International Relations at the University of the West Indies, together with the Caribbean Policy Consortium. I would like first to invite Professor Ivelo Lowe-Griffiths to give the welcome and opening remarks. Again, welcome everyone, and please, Professor Lowe-Griffiths.
Thank you, Dr. LaGuardia. Good afternoon and good evening, depending upon where in the world you are joining us from. I take the opportunity as co-founder, co-chair, and fellow of the Caribbean Policy Consortium to welcome you to this third episode of the partnership between the CPC and the Institute of International Relations, looking at issues, global, regional, Caribbean, and beyond, issues of relevance to the region. Some 2 decades ago, year 2005 to be exact, distinguished New York Times columnist Thomas Friedman provided the international community with a powerful indicator of globalization and interdependence. He did so in a powerful book, which I'm sure many will have read by now, called The World is Flat. And it's in the context of the flat world, a world where interdependence is a connective tissue across global landscape. It's in the context of that globalization, what he calls, we're in a globalization 3.0, that we have this conversation this afternoon, a conversation that says, yes, there's a conflict between Israel and Hamas, but it's a conflict that has implications for all Palestinians. And in the context of the connectivity of the global commons, Caribbean citizens are impacted in many different ways, and we'll get an appreciation of that connectivity, that impact from the panel as we exercise the intellectual discourse on the subject. We have a wonderful group of expert panelists. The introduction of those panelists will be done shortly by Dr. LaGuardia. And I invite you to participate intimately, not only by listening, reflecting, but by submitting questions and enabling us to have a wonderful, robust conversation. Thank you very much and welcome again. And over to the chair, Jacqueline LaGuardia Martinez.
Thank you, Professor Griffiths. I'm going now to introduce, it is my pleasure to introduce the panelists that we have today. As it has been informed, we have a diverse and engaging set of panelists that will bring a Caribbean perspective about around the conflict between Israel and Palestine. So I'm going to introduce all of them in the same order that they are going to present. First, let me start welcoming Mr. Lalu Hanuman. Mr. Lalu Hanuman is an attorney at law from 2007 and Secretary of the Caribbean Against Apartheid in Palestine, based in Barbados. Mr. Hanuman is also a current member of the Inns of Court, London, England. He holds a Bachelor in Law from Polytech of Central London, Westminster University, a diploma in Social Anthropology with distinction at the University of London, and a postgraduate diploma in Development Studies at the University of East Anglia. Additionally, Mr. Hanuman obtained a legal education certificate from the Hugh Gooding Law School in Trinidad and Tobago, and a master's in peace studies from the Coventry University in England. During this time, Mr. Hanuman was also the chairperson of the Barbados Bar Association's Human Rights Committee between 2013 and 2014. Apart from his academic achievements, Mr. Hanuman is also a member of the ARC Animal Welfare Society of Barbados, fighting for the enforcement of the animal abuse legislation in Barbados. Now I would like to introduce Dr. Anita Montoute, the Interim Director of the Institute of International Relations. Dr. Montoute holds a Doctor of Philosophy in International Relations since 2009, and postgraduate diploma in International Relations obtained in 2003, a Bachelor of Arts degree in History since 1996 from the University of the West Indies. She was a research fellow at the European Center for Development and Policy Management in 2012. She has taught several courses at the graduate level, postgraduate diploma and masters, including international history and politics, theory and methodology of international relations, multilateralism and global governance, political economy of development of international organizations, and international relations of the Caribbean. Her research interests include civil society, development and democracy, and relations between the African, Caribbean, and Pacific groups and the European Union. I would like now to welcome Ms. Denise Pitcher, Executive Director at the Caribbean Center of Human Rights. Ms. Denise Pitcher holds a Master of Arts in International Relations from Western University. Her human rights career began with an internship at the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees in India. She later joined Living Water Community, where she held position as a program officer and community-based protection associate, and worked on the development and implementation of programs and projects to facilitate the integration of asylum seekers and refugees in Trinidad and Tobago. Ms. Pitcher currently works with the Caribbean Center for Human Rights, founded in 2006 by Diane Mahavir Wyatt and the late Desmond Alum, Senior Counsel, as its Executive Director. The organization, the Caribbean Center for Human Rights, is an independent, non-profit, non-governmental organization dedicated to the promotion, protection, and defense of human rights in Trinidad and Tobago in the Caribbean. I would like now to introduce Dr. Anthony Peter Gonzalez, former IIR Interim Director, and has also worked as lecturer and senior lecturer at the Institute of International Relations, beginning in 1973 until 1978, and then from 1982 until 2003, where he taught international trade. He is also a former acting director, as I have indicated before, and from 2002 to 2003 also served as the interim director. Dr. Anthony Peter Gonzalez, from June 2003 to March 2007, was the director and representative of the Caribbean Regional Negotiation Machinery to the World Trade Organization in Geneva. He has published 52 academic articles for books, 55 technical papers and reports, and supervised extensively on master's and PhD theses in different organizations. I would like now to introduce His Excellency David Commissioning, Barbados Ambassador to CARICOM, Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Foreign Trade. His Excellency David Commissioning is a former senator in the government of Barbados and is currently Barbados Ambassador to the Caribbean Community and the Association of Caribbean States. He is also a founding member of the Caribbean Pan-African Network, the Clement Payne Movement of Barbados, the Caribbean chapter of the International Networks in Defense of Humanity, and the Global African Congress, and was an architect and first director of the Barbados government's Commission for Pan-African Affairs. He represented the Caribbean region at the 7th Pan-African Conference in Uganda, where he played a key role in the United Nations World Conference Against Racism in South Africa, and has represented the diaspora of the African Union Economic, Social, and Cultural Council. Ambassador Commissioner is a graduate of Harrison College in Barbados, the University of the West Indies in Cape Hill, and the Hugh Gooding Law School in Trinidad and Tobago. And finally, I would like to introduce Dr. Tiehimba Salandi, sociologist and lecturer at the Department of Behavioral Science at the University of the West Indies. Dr. Salandi is a sociology lecturer in the Department of Behavioral Science at the University of the West Indies, as I have just said. His research interests include mental health, alternative education models, decoloniality, inequality, working class movements, sustainable development, and the diverse cultures that make up the Caribbean. He lectured courses such as social change and development, sociology of education, Caribbean social problems, and Caribbean social structures. Again, I would like to welcome our panelists, and I would like to remind you that you have 7 minutes to do your presentation for us to have time to engage in a rich discussion with the rest of the attendees in these sessions. Without further ado, I would like to invite our first panelist, Mr. Lalu Hanuman, to do his presentation. Welcome again, Mr. Hanuman.
Greetings, everybody, and good evening. I understand that there's been some discussion behind the scenes as to the titling of today's seminar. Some people seem to think that it should have been called the Israel-Hamas War. So I will just start from that perspective, and I'll develop from there. I fail to see how or why it should be called the Israel-Hamas War, given the communal punishment and collective punishment that's currently being perpetrated against the people in Gaza, with some 16,000 civilian deaths, and out of that, 7,000 of them being children. Clearly, it's not an Israel-Hamas war, it's an Israel-Palestinian war. But even having said that, I don't know that the word war is the correct word, given the lack of symmetry between the parties. One party, the Israelis, have such sophisticated weaponry, from the Americans in particular, but not only from America, but a lot of it is from America, whereas the Palestinians are using homemade weaponry and stones to defend themselves. I think a better title would have been the Palestinian Holocaust, or even better, the Palestinian genocide, because that is what is taking place currently in Gaza. It's a genocide. As I mentioned, 16,000 people have died since the 7th of October alone. And of course, this goes way back in history. As the Secretary General, United Nations Secretary General, Mr. Guterres, pointed out, the 7th of October did not happen in a vacuum. And having said that, I abhor and criticize any act of violence against any civilian in any part of the world, whether we're talking about Kiev, or we're talking about Gaza, or we're talking about a kibbutzim in Israel. So I tolerate and condone no violence against any civilians. We get a lot of distorted information about what happened on the 7th of October in Israel. A lot of it has been debunked by the media subsequently. There were reports initially of decapitated babies. That has now been debunked. So what is fact and what is fiction is virtually unknown until such time as some sort of international inquiry takes place. But having said all of that, as I said, if there have been civilians who have been attacked by Hamas, I totally find that reprehensible. But it has to be seen, as Mr. Guterres says, in the context of what has been happening even before 1948, since the Balfour Declaration, in effect, since 1917. And there's a direct link with the Caribbean, which I think a lot of people don't know. Prior to the Balfour Declaration in 1917, the British, as they always do with other people's countries, actually offered the World Zionist Congress a part of Guyana to establish a Jewish state, the part called the Rupununi, which abuts both Brazil and Venezuela. They offered in the late 1800s the Rupununi to the World Jewish Congress, for the World Jewish Congress to establish a Zionist state there. The World Jewish Congress actually rejected that offer. And subsequently, they actually offered them a part of Uganda and also a part of Madagascar. So CARICOM could well have had Israel as part of it, had the Zionists accepted the offer of the Rupununi, or later on as well. President Harry Truman in the 1940s, after the Second World War, suggested to both the British, the Dutch, and the French that by way of paying off war debts to the United States of America, that a Jewish homeland should be created in the three Guyanas, in what was then British Guyana, Dutch Guyana, and still is French Guyana. So again, we could have had an Israel in the Caribbean. As I said, a lot of people don't know this history, but it's a factual history. And we know that in 1947, on the 29th of November 1947, the United Nations collectively decided to partition Palestine and create a Jewish state and an Arab state there. And this is what gives the issue currently in Palestine an international character, because it's the world, as it then was, the United Nations, that actually created the conditions for the establishment of the State of Israel. So whatever is happening in Israel is a global issue. They also set up the United Nations Refugee Agency to deal with the fallout of their decision of the partition, because between the period 1917 to 1948, when the State of Israel was created, the British had the mandate through the League of Nations to actually control Palestine, and they allowed a number of Jews fleeing Hitler's Germany and from other parts of the world to go and migrate into Palestine. At the time of the 1917 Balfour Declaration, the Jewish population in Palestine was a mere 5%. And in fact, there was a bigger Jewish population in another part of the Ottoman Empire, which is also not widely known, what was then called Salonika in Greece. In fact, the Jews in Salonika comprised some 60% of the population of Salonika at the time. And they had actually petitioned the League of Nations to have a Jewish state established in Salonika and the surrounding areas. But the League of Nations turned that request down. So the British, as I said, had the mandate for Palestine following the defeat of the Ottoman Empire, and they allowed a number of Jews to relocate there. And interestingly enough, Hitler and the Nazi Party were fully in support of the establishment of a Palestinian homeland as well. It's not well known, but again, Adolf Eichmann, who Israel subsequently captured in Argentina and had him executed in Israel, he was there in Jerusalem in the 1930s, actually directly responsible at the request of Hitler to encourage Jewish migration into Palestine from Germany, from the Third Reich. There's an interesting book by a person called Edwin Black called The Transfer Agreement, which actually traces this, whereby the Nazis actually facilitated Jewish settlement from Germany into Palestine, into what is now called Israel. And in fact, the Zionists collaborated fully with Hitler at that time, much to the annoyance of the World Jewish Congress and various anti-Nazi groups, because they had initiated, the anti-Nazi groups and the World Jewish Congress, a boycott of Nazi German products. But the Zionists broke that and breached that boycott, such that they were able to get a benefit from it by getting Hitler's support for the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine. And following the unilateral declaration of independence in 1948 by the Zionists, there was what the Palestinians called the Nakba, which is the expulsion of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians. And they're still living in refugee camps in surrounding countries, in Syria, Tunisia, Lebanon, Jordan, etc., to this day, some 3 generations later. Of course, we know what happened in 1967, the unprovoked attack by Israel on what is now called the West Bank and East Jerusalem and Gaza. And since then, these places have been occupied territories by Israel. Zionism has a very anti-Semitic origin, as I mentioned, the collaboration that they had with the Nazis. And the effects of Zionism is also to create anti-Semitism. The anti-Semitism that currently exists in the world largely is as a result of the establishment of the State of Israel. And the State of Israel actually uses, interestingly enough, today, the same Nazi-type tactics and racist tactics that the Jews were subjected to by Hitler in the 1930s. And they used the terminology of racism as well, in much the same way as Hitler unfortunately described the Jews as rats. We know in the Rwandan genocide, the Tutsis were described as cockroaches. Today in Israel, the Palestinians are being described as animals. It's the same type of terminology and it's the same type of approach that they've adopted towards the Palestinians. I understand my time is out, so I will end there. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hanuman. You have been very respectful with time, and thanks for bringing this historic context to the situation we are analyzing today from a Caribbean perspective. I would like to invite now Dr. Anita Montut for her 7 minutes presentation. Please, Dr. Montut.
Thank you, Chair. My presentation will examine the response of the international community and related to the implications for the Caribbean's role in UN Security Council reform in particular. What I'm going to argue in my brief presentation is that our focus should be less on the voting patterns of members of the international community, the declarations and actions of individual countries, and more on the governance structure of the UN and the implications this has for the ability of the international community to respond in a decisive manner to resolve conflicts which threaten international peace and security. I will end by relating this to the Caribbean's diplomacy on UN reform of the UN Security Council. Let me first start with the immediate response of governments to the Hamas attacks on Israel on October 7th and the subsequent retaliation of Israel. These responses can be categorized crudely as follows. 1, those who condemn Hamas attacks as an act of terrorism and have supported Israel's right to self-defense. These countries include mostly North American and European countries. Secondly, those who have placed responsibility on Israel for the attacks. These include many of the regional players such as Iran, Saudi Arabia, Syria, Iraq, etc. Those who express horror at the attacks but have not called in an act of terror and have called both sides and the international community to work towards the resolution of the conflict. Many calling to renew the two-state solution process. Some of these countries include Turkey, China, Russia, etc. Some countries have changed their initial response of sympathy to Israel in light of the scale of the retaliation and its impact on civilians. Some Latin American countries, for example, have used the strongest possible language to condemn Israel's retaliation, including Colombia, Bolivia, and Chile, all condemning the Israeli occupation and violence against Palestinians. Venezuela urged for an end to the conflict via the UN and blamed the flare-up on the ability of the Palestinian people to be able to assert their historical rights. Similarly, the response from regional organizations is divided as well as the international community, but the responses generally reflect that of the individual membership. But I want to point out the African Union here because I have examples from the EU, NATO, which are pretty obvious, well, for the most part. The African Union said that the denial of the fundamental rights of the Palestinian people is the main cause of the permanent Israeli-Palestine tension. I would like to now move on to, because of the long protracted process, this conflict has really been unrelenting, and there have been many, many resolutions from the Security Council, from the General Assembly on various aspects of the conflict. We know, including principles for just and lasting peace, calls for peace negotiations, the rights of the Palestinian people to self-determination, national independence, sovereignty, etc., etc. The UN has played a very important role in what was among one of the most significant developments, arguably, towards lasting peace between Israel and Palestine. That is the Oslo Accord of 1993. The UN's involvement was essential both as the guardian of international legitimacy and in the mobilization and provision of international assistance. In this current situation, we saw the General Assembly resolution we all know about, calling for the immediate sustained humanitarian truce leading to cessation of hostilities between Israel and Hamas. And then we had the Security Council resolution for the immediate release of hostages held by Hamas and urgent and extended humanitarian pauses and corridors through the Gaza Strip to facilitate the provision of essential goods and services. And, I think that resolution is important. So I'm just highlighting some of the responses of some of the players there. Russia stated that the humanitarian pauses cannot replace a ceasefire or truce, adding that the US has consistently blocked efforts to cease hostilities, paralyzing the work of the main UN organ to maintain peace and security. China said that the Council should have adopted a more robust resolution earlier. The UK was disappointed that Hamas's act was not seen as terrorism. The US expressed the same sentiments, and also was disappointed that Israel was not accorded the right to self-defense. Now, this is where I believe we should really place more emphasis. Despite the UN's best efforts and that of the international community, this conflict continues unabated. In fact, it seems to be getting worse. And this leads me to the point I would like to stress, and my argument, as I stated in the beginning, and the role and implications for the Caribbean. By way of a short introduction, among the 6 principal organs of the United Nations are the General Assembly and the Security Council. The General Assembly is the main deliberative organ of the UN, and it consists of the entire membership. Each member carries 1 vote, and its decisions are non-binding on the membership. The Security Council has main responsibility for maintaining international peace and security. It has 15 members, 5 permanent, China, France, Russian Federation, the United Kingdom, and the United States, and 10 non-permanent members who are elected on a 2-year term. All members, like the General Assembly, have 1 vote, but the permanent members carry some extra weight by virtue of the fact that they also possess veto power. Security Council decisions are binding on membership of the UN. This governance structure has proven to be ineffective in bringing an end to an almost 80-year conflict, and more depending on where one thinks that the starting point is. I would like to start by concurring with the sentiments of Ambassador Dennis Francis, the UN General Assembly's president, who suggested that the wars in Ukraine and Gaza have put into sharp focus the urgency for moving swiftly towards Security Council reform. This is evidenced by the failure of the Security Council to come up with a unified position on Russia's invasion of Ukraine last year and the ongoing Israel-Palestine conflict. Francis said, quote, "Violence and war continue to spread in regions across the world, while the United Nations seems paralyzed due largely to the division in the Security Council," end of quote. With the world undergoing major disruptions by way of an intensification of conflicts in diverse regions, the Council is, quote, "dangerously falling short," end of quote, of its mandate as the primary custodian of international peace and security. He added, quote, "absent structural reforms, its performance and legitimacy will inevitably continue to suffer, and so to the credibility and relevance of the UN itself," end of quote. For instance, the UN Security Council passed its first resolution on the crisis after 4 failed attempts, 5 weeks after the crisis started. The above view is echoed by the majority of UN membership and groupings working towards UN reform. For the purpose of this presentation, I focus on the L69 group of countries of which the Caribbean is a part. The L69 group is comprised of developing countries from Africa, Latin America, and the Caribbean, Asia, and the Pacific, who are seeking comprehensive and sustainable reform of the UN Security Council. The group is calling for expansion in both permanent and non-permanent categories of membership, with better representation of the developing world. Specifically, they are proposing adding 6 new permanent members, 2 from Africa, 2 from Asia, 1 from Latin America and the Caribbean, 1 from the Western European and others group. Additionally, the L69 advocates for rotating non-permanent seat for small island developing states, or SIDS. In light of Israel, Palestine, and Russia, Ukraine, the deputy permanent representative from St. Vincent and the Grenadines, who was representing the L69, Nidra Miguel, who said that the Security Council is, quote, "no longer fit for purpose." This is because the Council does not reflect current geopolitical realities. Secondly, there is an overrepresentation of Western countries which does not take into account the diverse composition of the international community. Reform is therefore not only urgent, but foundational to international peace, stability, security, and an effective multilateral order. This position is echoed by other groups, including the group of 4 consisting of Brazil, Germany, India, and Japan, which all incidentally aspire to become permanent members of the Council, stating that the current membership of the Council does not allow it to address contemporary challenges effectively. The only significant reform of the Security Council took place in 1965. This was reflective of the increase in membership from 51 founding UN members in 1945 to 113 by 1963 as a result of decolonization. Today, the rationale for UN reform is more pressing than it has ever been, because of increasing membership, now totaling on 193, changing geopolitical realities, increasing multipolarity and global distribution of power, which is far removed from the realities of 1945, and the unprecedented dire state of international peace and security. Partly as a result of the shortcomings of the UN, we have seen long protracted conflicts, humanitarian catastrophes, and even genocide. Now, I'm not totally dismissing and canceling the United Nations, because we know, we are all aware of the remarkable work of the United Nations, but we are talking about here the Security Council, which is mainly responsible for keeping international peace and security. My time is up, and I will leave the rest of what I have to say for the question and discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Montud, for expanding the conversation and the analysis to the global scenario and bringing multilateralism and geopolitics to the analysis. Please, I would like to invite now Ms. Denise Pitcher for your between 7-10 minutes presentation. Welcome, and please, the floor is yours.
Good evening, and thank you. My presentation will focus on the human rights considerations in the Israel-Gaza conflict. The current conflict, emphasis on the word conflict rather than war, because Gaza is occupied by Israel, and given the asymmetrical nature of the conflict, is, as we know, not an isolated event. And to understand the situation today, it is important to reflect on the history and context of the conflict and the human rights violations that preceded October 7th, to understand why we are where we are today, and to explore whether the possibility exists for a peaceful resolution to the conflict where rights can be achieved for both the Israeli and Palestinian people. The current conflict is rooted in the decades-long Palestinian struggle for self-determination and equal rights, which was precipitated with the 1917 Balfour Declaration, which pledged to provide a home for Jewish people within Palestine. What followed was the systematic and violent displacement of Palestinians, culminating in 1948 when Jewish leaders declared the establishment of the State of Israel. The 1967 Arab-Israeli War, which expanded Israeli control and occupation over Palestinian territory, entrenched Israel's oppression and violation of Palestinian human rights. Since 1967, Israel's ruthless policies of land confiscation, illegal settlements, and dispossession, coupled with rampant discrimination, have inflicted immense suffering on Palestinians, depriving them of their basic rights. Israel's military rule disrupts every aspect of daily life in the occupied Palestinian territories. It affects whether, when, and how Palestinians can travel to work or school, travel abroad, visit relatives, earn a living, or even access to electricity or a clean water supply. Fundamental human rights, such as the right to self-determination and freedom of movement, protected under the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, are violated daily by Israeli occupation. Israeli occupation and settlements are considered illegal under international law. Israel has not been spared as a consequence of this ongoing conflict, and also has been the target of indiscriminate bombing by Hamas. Attempts to find a peaceful resolution failed with the Oslo peace process, and the possibility of a two-state solution seems out of reach in the face of aggression by both sides, the emergence of Hamas as a political actor backed by powerful allies, and more hardened positions as a consequence of successive conflicts. October 7th. Hamas's attack on Israel on October 7th was horrific and can be considered a war crime under international law. According to Article 51 of the UN Charter, states have the right to self-defense in the face of an armed attack. However, the right to self-defense must be balanced against the principles of necessity, proportionality, and immediacy. The Geneva Conventions and its additional protocols, which defines the laws of armed conflict, protects civilians and civilian objects. It states that civilians are protected persons in armed conflict, and that civilian hospitals should not be the object of an attack and be respected and protected at all times. Israel's response to date violates these principles given its disproportionate response, killing over 16,000 people, 6,600 of them children, with the indiscriminate bombing of hospitals, refugee camps, and schools. Journalists and United Nations staff have also accounted for numerous casualties of this conflict. Several UN agencies, human rights organizations, and the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres have consistently called for an end to the bloodshed. However, these calls continue to be ignored by those who have the power and authority to influence Israeli actions. The UN Security Council seems powerless to act in the face of these atrocities and is hamstrung by geopolitical rivalry. Save the Children, commenting on the powerlessness of the UN Security Council, issued this statement. If the UN Security Council cannot uphold its mandate to promote peace, security, and respect for human rights and international law, then the system is failing. Brazilian President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva issued his own condemnation, stating that the body's failure to enforce respect for its decisions is part of the cause of the ongoing bombardment in the Gaza Strip. It is clear, based on the actions and the legal definitions under the Rome Statute, which governs the International Criminal Court, that war crimes and crimes against humanity are being committed in Gaza, and possibly genocide. Article 6 of the Rome Statute defines genocide as any acts committed with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group, such as killing members of the group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. Article 7 of the Rome Statute defines crimes against humanity as any acts when committed as part of a widespread or systematic attack directed against any civilian population with knowledge of the attack. And Article 8 of the Rome Statute defines war crimes as grave breaches of the Geneva Conventions, namely any of the following acts against persons or property protected under the provisions of the relevant Geneva Conventions, such as willful killing, torture or inhuman treatment, willfully causing great suffering or serious injury to body or health, extensive destruction and appropriation of property, not justified by military necessity and carried out unlawfully and wantonly. Indeed, 5 states, South Africa, Bangladesh, Bolivia, and the East African nations of Comoros and Djibouti have already referred cases to the International Criminal Court to investigate Israeli attacks in Gaza. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict exposes the weaknesses of the UN Security Council, which is often at the mercy of geopolitical rivalry, and its selective nature in being able to act in events where gross human rights violations and mass atrocities are being committed. This is concerning for us in CARICOM, given Venezuela's desire right next door to essentially attempt to annex the Essequibo region, and given the political forces at play in both states. Should war erupt next door, will we also be forced to watch human rights atrocities committed? And are we confident the UN Security Council will act to protect fundamental human rights? Or is the possibility of a protracted conflict a concern for us here in CARICOM, given the Venezuelan-Guyana issue at hand right now? Thank you very much, and that concludes my presentation.
Thank you very much, Ms. Pitcher, for bringing the discussion into the lens of human rights very necessarily, and also to give us information about international law and mechanism existent. I would like now to invite Dr. Anthony Peter Gonzalez, former interim director of the Institute and recognized a scholar of the region, to please give us your remarks. So please, Dr. Gonzalez, up to you now.
Yes, thank you very much, Dr. LaGuardia. Thanks for the Institute for inviting me, and a pleasant good evening to all members of the panel and the viewing public. I want to focus mainly on the Caribbean approach, or rather the CARICOM approach to this conflict. And I want basically to try to answer 2 questions. One is, why is there a lack of coordination? Why can't we get a common policy in CARICOM on this particular question? And the second question I want to answer is, how is this issue evolving among CARICOM? Are we moving more towards Israel, or are we moving more towards Palestine? So starting with the first question, I want to say, first of all, that recently I've noticed that CARICOM is having tremendous difficulty in finding common ground in foreign policy. We are aware of what happened with Venezuela, with Maduro, and how there was a different reaction among the countries of the region with respect to the Americans proposing Guaido. We know also of the recent decision or the resolution on the Ukraine war, where some abstained and some voted against Russia and so on. And there are other cases like that. And that, in a way, has led me to ask the question of why is it so difficult to get a common policy on Israel? I'm saying this because of the fact that you may have seen a statement from CARICOM, which says that we all agree that there should be some cessation of hostilities. We all agree that there have been atrocities and, the Palestinians have suffered disproportionately and so forth. But when we go out there and we look at the the General Assembly Resolution 242, for instance, which deals with the question of the cessation of hostilities, the need for a ceasefire, and humanitarian assistance and so forth, we see a slightly different picture. We see Haiti abstaining, and also we see Jamaica not being present to vote. So we have to ask ourselves, why is it possible that we can probably get a statement out of CARICOM which says that basically what the UN resolution says, because essentially the resolution was about a ceasefire. Why can we agree on a statement that says there should be a ceasefire, or when we go to the UN, we take a slightly different position? So I'm trying in a way to understand that and see what is the problem here? Why are countries having difficulty here when they go on the international stage to take certain positions against certain countries? I have noticed, for instance, that there are more or less like two poles on that situation. You have first of all Belize, which is very anti-Israel, and that has, of course, has a history way back, and we know basically why that is so. I think largely the influence in government of certain descendants of Palestine in the Belize government, and that has perpetuated itself up to today. And they've always taken a very strong anti-Israel position. So their position has been well known, and it is basically ideological. The rest of CARICOM more or less seem to operate on a kind of transactional basis. And even though over the years they find common ground, they have called for a two-stage resolution, and they have more or less stayed with that. You find that to some extent there's some variation coming in now. And it's that variation I'm trying in a way to suggest that may be coming largely from the fact that Israel has made some inroads into the region. Israel has expanded its cooperation with a larger number of countries in CARICOM. They have offered training for youths in several areas, for example, in entrepreneurship, in renewable energy, in health, in education. And most importantly, I think they have offered training and technology in a very sensitive area, which has to do with national security. If you check basically some of the key Israel companies involved in this region here, you may basically find that, for example, I know in Trinidad, to some extent in Jamaica, you'd find that they essentially involved with technology that has to do with radar or software to deal with how you penetrate, let's say, WhatsApp and stuff like that and so forth. They are very intimate with governments in this region in terms of dealing with national security questions. So that even though Palestine has made some ground over the years, we have recognized Palestine. There's a Palestinian ambassador to the region she comes around, I think, from time to time. But even though we have done that, and even though the world has changed tremendously, there's more anti-Israel protests in the world. We see it in the United States. We see it in this region here. For example, you would notice that many non-governmental groups, for instance, the Muslims, for example, the trade unionists, students, university students, and others, for instance, they are becoming much more active, and they're very anti-Israel in terms of protests and so forth. So you may tend to look at that and say, well, to some extent, CARICOM governments may have to adjust. But I want to suggest that in the real world of what you might call realpolitik, the governments are much more concerned with their relationship with Israel. And I tend to figure, for example, that while Belize may have no relations with Israel, for instance, Belize was able to break off relations with Israel. They broke diplomatic relations. I think they broke in consular relations. So Belize right now probably has no relations with Israel. The rest of CARICOM has maintained relations with Israel. And I want to believe that because of the growing insecurity in the region, because of all the dangers with organized crime and the trends in the region in terms of geopolitics, this has worked in the favor of Israel, and that Israel has been able to gain a significant amount of favor in dealing with the CARICOM governments. So I'm not very optimistic as to how an anti-Israel position or strong Israeli anti-Israel position, somewhat, let's say, that could approach what we see in Belize. I'm not too optimistic that could result, largely because of the concerns I think governments have in dealing with national security and all these problems that surround them, and the desire to get access to Israeli technology and get the Israelis to assist them. My fear is that they have become very, very transactional, and in that respect, that transactional approach will tend to outweigh the ideological approach. I think, in a sense, that is what I'm trying to say. There's a lot more one can say about this, but basically, I tend to feel that as I look down the road, I look to the future and try to see how this will evolve. I tend to see a growing influence of Israel over Palestine, let's say, even though what we see among the population may be slightly different. But my feelings basically is that governments operates on what you have done for me and what my relationship is with you, and you will tend to stick with Israel, even though probably the majority of the population might be crying out for an anti-Israeli position. So basically, in a sense, that is what I want to say. I'm just going to stop there and sum it up. There's a lot more we can say, but I take that in question time. Thank you very much, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Dr. Gonzalez, and thank you for bringing the perspective from CARICOM responses and how it seems that the consensus in foreign policy seems to be seems not to be present this time as a dangerous trend that we might be seeing in recent times. And now that before inviting Ambassador Commissioning, I would like to recognize the presence of members of the diplomatic community that are following this webinar. I would like to welcome Ambassador Cordero from Venezuela, based here in Trinidad and Tobago, and also the Minister of Foreign Affairs of St. Lucia, Mr. Alba Batiz. Welcome to this webinar. So having said that, Ambassador Commissioning, please, would you like to do your remarks at this moment? Between 7 and 10 minutes, please.
Thank you very much. And permit me to begin by debunking this idea that CARICOM's foreign policy is transactional. Let me also make the point that CARICOM consists of 14 independent member states. And these are all independent sovereign member states. The CARICOM Treaty directs the member states to try to coordinate their foreign policy. But there's no guarantee that 14 individual independent states will at all times come to exactly the same position. CARICOM tends to operate on the basis of the fundamental principles of international law. And most times, CARICOM is able to come to a collective position. However, there are occasions where when big powers are involved and big power politics are involved, sometimes you do find big power divide and rule politics may pull away one or two of the CARICOM countries from the consensus. But you would generally find that the majority do adhere to a common principled position. Having said that, let me begin, since I am Barbados's ambassador to CARICOM, let me begin by a statement made by the Prime Minister of Barbados on the 18th of November 2023 in relation to this situation that we are discussing. And I'm quoting now Prime Minister Mia Amor Motley speaking during a press conference at Grantley Adams International Airport. And this is what she said: "What is going on in Gaza is a tragedy, and it offends every human sensibility. We were offended for sure on October 7th when persons were killed in Israel in acts that were utter terror. But what has happened since then is dwarfing that in terms of the scale. I don't even think that horror and terror is sufficient to describe it, because separate from the bombs, the notion that people in Palestine will not have access to water, or people do not have access to fuel, or that babies have to lie on beds cuddling next to one another in the pictures that we have seen in order to keep some level of warmth. These things are not good. It is perhaps the first televised genocide. Let me repeat that. Prime Minister Motley said that what we are seeing in Gaza is perhaps the first televised genocide. Now that's a very strong statement. Let me also read the text of the statement that CARICOM issued on the 12th of November 2023. CARICOM issued two statements in relation to this matter. The first statement was issued on the 9th of October, 2 days after the initial eruption on 7th of October. And that statement tended to be somewhat even-handed, chastising Hamas and Israel. But that statement, even from the 9th of October, called for an immediate ceasefire. However, by the 12th of November, as that Israeli attack on Gaza reached horrendous proportions, killing thousands of Palestinian civilians, including many children, this is what the Caribbean community said, and I'm going to quote the 12th of November statement. Quote, "The Caribbean community expresses horror and concern at the mounting death toll on the civilian population, including women and children, particularly in Gaza, but also in other areas of the occupied Palestinian territory. The community calls on all states to respect and ensure respect for international humanitarian law in all circumstances in accordance with Article 1 of the Geneva Conventions. The community condemns any disregard for international humanitarian law, human rights, and the laws of war that have resulted in the widespread destruction of civilian infrastructure in Gaza and deprivation of access to basic necessities, including medical care for the people of Palestine. The community further calls for 1, an immediate ceasefire in Gaza, 2, the immediate release of all hostages and for their humane treatment at all times, 3, all parties to immediately and fully comply with their obligations under international law, including international humanitarian law, and the immediate, safe, unimpeded access for adequate, sustained humanitarian support throughout Gaza, including food, water, medicines, medical care, fuel, and electricity," end of quote. Now, I don't know how firm CARICOM or Barbados could be in making those statements. It is also noteworthy that when the UN General Assembly passed their resolution on the 27th of October, that 12 CARICOM member states, 12 of the 14, voted for the resolution. So why focus on the one that abstained and the one that was not present, and don't focus on the 12 that voted for it. It is also noteworthy that 10 CARICOM member states have recognized the state of Palestine as a sovereign entity. Admittedly, there are 4 that have not done so. Bahamas, Trinidad and Tobago, Jamaica, and Barbados. But all of them have recognized the 2-state solution as the only way forward, and I can assure you that decisions are being made in relation to this matter of the urgency of recognizing the state of Palestine. I also want to refer to the position taken by Belize. I don't know how you could simply dismiss or treat the very principled position taken by Belize as some anti-Israeli position based on the fact that people of Palestinian descent or ancestry occupied positions in the Belizean government at some point in time. I don't accept that. Belize went beyond the CARICOM statement. The CARICOM made a statement, very strong statement, but on the 14th of November, Belize not only made its own statement, and I think I should read some of the Belize statement. I think it's important. Belize said, since the 7th of October 2023, the Israeli Defense Force has engaged in unceasing, indiscriminate bombing in Gaza, which has killed more than 11,000 innocent civilians, mostly women and children. The bombing has destroyed many buildings and infrastructure, including hospitals, schools, and other infrastructure. Since the 7th of October 2023, Israel has consistently violated international law, international humanitarian law, and the human rights of Gazans. With the approval of the cabinet and other PUP, People's United Party members of the House of Representatives, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Foreign Trade and Immigration has implemented the following measures that are to take immediate effect. A, the government of Belize is withdrawing its agreement for the accreditation of His Excellency Einat Kranz-Niger, Israel's ambassador designate to Belize. All activities conducted by the Israeli honorary consulate in Belize and the appointment of the honorary consul are suspended. The government of Belize is further suspending all activities of Belize's honorary consulate in Tel Aviv, Israel, and withdrawing the appointment of its honorary consul. And the government of Belize is also withdrawing its request for accreditation of Mr. Jonathan Enav as Belize's honorary consul. Belize renews its call for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza, unimpeded access to humanitarian supplies into Gaza, and the release of all hostages. End of quote. I must say that Belize made me very proud as a citizen of CARICOM. My only wish was that all CARICOM member states would have joined in solidarity with Belize. That's my personal wish. I am not speaking now for the government of Barbados. I'm speaking for David Commichon. As a citizen of the Caribbean community, Belize made me proud. And I think CARICOM, we should have learned the lesson from 1972 when we collectively came together, defied the United States of America, defied the Organization of American States, and recognized Cuba, the revolutionary government of Cuba. And of course, because we did it collectively, there's strength and there's security in acting collectively. And so the Americans were upset in 1972, but what happened? We broke the ice. And virtually the rest, the whole of the hemisphere followed in follow the example that we had set. So I think my 7 minutes or 10 minutes are up. But I want to say that what is happening in Gaza, it is terrible, and it is terrible that the United Nations Security Council, which has the primary responsibility for dealing with that situation, for bringing an end to the televised genocide that we are seeing, has really disgraced itself. And it just emphasizes that we have to reform that institution. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador Commissioning, and thanks for bringing for expanding the perspective from the CARICOM view and our governments in the region. I would like now to invite our late panelist, Dr. Salandi, to please take the floor and use your between 7-10 minutes time to give your remarks.
Greetings, everyone. It's a pleasure to be present in this webinar to share my thoughts on the intersections of the Caribbean and Palestine/Israel. When I talk to many people in my space, there's a sense of disconnection about the ongoing issues. So we have so much issues of human rights abuses, genocide, the apartheid of our times, one of the world's largest open-air prisons. And in spite of all of this we have ongoing, many people on the ground are almost oblivious, because many times they have their own ongoing struggles to survive and ongoing issues that they are trying to deal with in their own space. So for many people, the ongoing genocide and the loss of life seems very, very, very far away. And it isn't as urgent as it should be, given the ongoing situation in Palestine, where so much persons are being deprived not only of basic rights, but also of access to medicine, food, healthcare, etc. In the area where I am from, ironically, there is a place called Gaza, which is called Gaza because at many times of day and night, it could be very violent with gunshots ringing out. Also in my community recently, on the walls leading to the highway, persons have marked graffiti asserting that Gaza shall be free. As a sociologist, I'm interested in several things. I'm interested in how people make sense of the ongoing conflict, as well as I'm interested in the historical roots of it, and how do we understand what is happening, even in spite of the ongoing propaganda war. When we look at the history of the Caribbean, most of the Caribbean has been shaped by the forces of imperialism and genocide. And it is the same imperial arrogance and imperial violence that also have created and shaped the ongoing situation between Palestine and Israel. And I like that the previous presenters mentioned the Balfour Declaration of 1917. And this was a clear-cut case of Britain using its imperial might to bring about a certain outcome that was not necessarily in the best interest of people of Palestine. And ironically, what happened in that region afterwards actually went against one of the later clauses of the Balfour Agreement that said, and I quote, "Nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of the existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine." And all of that led up to 1948, in which people were displaced to make way for this Jewish homeland. And today we have all of these arrangements of international law and international agreements and so-called international organizations, which have the aura of being all-inclusive democratic institutions and entities that represent all of us, when this is clearly not the case. And I was quite heartened to hear Dr. Mantous's analysis, pointing to the need to reform the infrastructures of the United Nations, especially the United Nations Security Council. Because we in the Caribbean here, we have almost been subserviently integrated into a global capitalist political world system, where many times our rights and interests have not necessarily been properly heard and properly considered. And I fear that too many times, Caribbean leaders have been on the wrong side of history and that they have not been able to voice concerns strongly enough against all the imperial wars and wars of aggression that have happened since our independence. And I listened intently about the analysis about transactional relationships. And it may be quite true that the economic benefits or the perceived economic benefits and the relationships that Caribbean countries have with dominant Western powers sometimes get in the way of us being on the right side of history in terms of speaking out, lending support, and ensuring that our economic relationships do not make us complicit in ongoing acts of genocide. So I am quite concerned with my government's relationship with Israel. And I don't think that any amount of national security technology is enough to compensate for resources that may go in the hands of persons who are participating in acts of aggression, occupation, apartheid, and genocide. So we have to understand the Caribbean's place in a hostile world, having to interface with a whole set of international agreements and international organizations that have this aura of being democratic when they are not democratic in terms of their constitution and many of the outcomes of these processes. So the US has used its veto power at least 24 times, mainly against resolutions criticizing Israel. In addition, Israel has violated at least 28 resolutions of the Security Council. And the majority of these resolutions were towards outlining a framework of peace that spoke about the right of the Palestinians to have their own homeland, or called for Israel to abide by international laws, and even called on Israel to stop the illegal settlements. And in spite of all of these resolutions, nothing much have changed in terms of the actual day-to-day lives of the experiences of people in Palestine. And if persons are disappointed or saddened or outraged by the attacks on Israel in early October by Hamas, we have to ask ourselves, who created Hamas? And who created the circumstances in which Hamas have existed? And if we look at the history, Hamas was supported by Israel as an attempt to destabilize and weaken a different faction in Palestine. So all of what we are seeing today are reactions that are happening within a general framework, set in motion by imperialist powers who, with great imperial arrogance, sat in their own countries and wanted to remove and displace persons who would have been existing on this land. And we in the Caribbean here, we have to think seriously about our engagement and involvement with a range of international organizations, because is it that a lot of these international laws and international agreements are a farce if dominant powers can easily choose which agreements and which laws they would abide by, and when it's time in relation to another country, they want to totally enforce it. So that weakens the ability of international law to be a framework to bring about equal rights and justice for all countries and all peoples in the world. When we look at the roots of both the Palestine-Israel issue and our issues here in the Caribbean, we in the Caribbean have been shaped by the same forces of empire that we are still struggling to remove from our laws and from our education system. And we still have all of these monuments and place names and epistemologies many centuries after independence. So despite the formal achievement of independence, all of the infrastructures of coloniality and the constitution of an entire world system made up of a whole set of international agreements and international agencies and laws have not been democratic and inclusive of a world in which the principles of justice and the ability of sovereignty to be respected when it's not a Western power, these things are still a far away journey from being realized because of how the current constitution of world power is distributed. So in conclusion, we need to rethink seriously how we think about issues of justice to ensure that justice isn't just an abstract concept, but that we evolve international, political, and a sort of foreign policy that allows Caribbean people to have a better understanding of global conflicts that would allow the Caribbean region to be on the right side of history and the right side of justice. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Salandi, for bringing this other perspective also from the Caribbean region and remind us about important issues for the discussion as imperialism, colonialism, and its legacies in the region and how it connects with the conflict that we are examining today. I will now open the floor for questions and comments. I have 3 questions, all of the 3 coming from Nicolas Jagdio. I'm going to read the 3 questions and then I'm going to invite all panelists to react to them. The first 2 questions were specifically addressed to Mr. Hanuman. First question is, if Mr. Hanuman is saying that we cannot make any assumption about October the 7th, how can we make assumptions about what is happening in Gaza? And the second one is reads as follows. What is the distinction between World Zionist Congress and the Zionists? The third question that has been addressed for Dr. Salandi, also coming from Nicolas Jagdio, says, please explain how Israel is apartheid, since you are using this term. So again, I'm going to invite now each of the panelists to react, even if the questions were addressed to 2 of them, but I would like all of you to have the opportunity in these first rounds of questions. So starting with Mr. Hanuman, please.
Right, you can hear me now. Yes, good evening again to everybody. The first question about the assumptions to do with the 7th of October, as Mr. Commission pointed out in quoting the Honorable Mia Motley, we're seeing the genocide on our television screens. There's no dispute that 7,000 children have been dismembered. There's no dispute that 16,000 civilians have been killed. It's clear on our televisions. It's indisputable. But what is disputable is what happened on the 7th of October in the kibbutzim in Israel. In fact, there's evidence that, in fact, the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, in fighting against Hamas on the day, they actually killed a lot of their own civilians. There's evidence of weaponry that clearly Hamas never had, tank fire and so on, being delivered into buildings. And in fact, the IDF even called down aerial support to bomb certain places where the Hamas fighters were, and in so doing, kill some of their own civilians. So the facts in terms of what's happened on the 7th of October in Israel, in the kibbutzim, are yet to be clearly divulged. But what is happening in Gaza on a daily basis, we've heard various Jewish politicians, Zionist politicians, calling the Gazans animals and calling for their extermination, calling for the use of nuclear weapons against Gaza. We know about the weaponization of food. We know about the weaponization of medicines. We know about the weaponization of water. We know about the weaponization of fuel for cooking. All of these things are happening and in full view of the media. We know that 77 journalists have been murdered by the IDF in Gaza. And so the list goes on and on. So there's nothing to assume. It's a fact that genocide is happening, as the Honorable Mia Motley rightly pointed out. And in terms of the question about the difference between the World Zionist Congress and the World Jewish Congress, the World Zionist Congress apparently was in 1897. It was initiated in Switzerland. And the World Jewish Congress was in 1936, again in Switzerland. And it's interesting that the person who was the motivation or the motivator behind the World Zionist Congress, Herzl was his name. He actually said that our greatest supporters in Europe are the anti-Semites. And that is still the case today. The biggest supporters of the state of Israel are places like the Czech Republic, Poland, Hungary, etc., that don't want Jews to return, Jews who were expelled in the Second World War. These are the anti-Semites that support Israel today. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Mr. Hanuman. Now, Dr. Montut, if there is something you would like to add now.
I would just like to make a more general comment about placing things in time and in time. I think it's important for any analysis to take into to take things into perspective, and timing is very important. You know, what we normally do, and I wouldn't say normally, but what we sometimes do is that our discussions are ahistorical. I think that in this particular context, although we need diplomatic solutions and, you know, we speak about the geopolitics, but I don't think that we can ignore one of the issues that are at the core of this conflict that goes way, way back. And so in our analysis, we have to remember to historicize. And so the role of religion, traditions, and beliefs has played a very important role. And so it's important to look at the history and to not look at it as something that just happened on October 7th. That's what I would want to say in terms of historicizing and thinking in terms of space and time for this conflict.
Thank you, Dr. Montut. Please, Ms. Denise Pitcher.
Yes, thank you. I would just like to echo what Mr. Hanuman said in terms of how do we know what's going on in Gaza. I mean, there have been numerous human rights organizations and United Nations agencies who have all, you know, issued statements condemning, the ongoing atrocities in Gaza. I personally have been following quite a number of Palestinian journalists who have been working on the ground and sharing footage, non-stop footage on a daily basis and risking their own lives. So you can see it's not difficult now. I mean, with social media now, they've been able to share quite a lot of footage in terms of what's happening there. And you see all the bloodshed, you see the indiscriminate attacks, you see the hospitals being attacked. So, you know, I mean, and yes, with regards to what happened on October 7th in Israel, there was so much misinformation and disinformation and propaganda that was issued by the Israeli government that we're now learning, you know, as time passes and when a thorough investigation is conducted, we will learn more. But there are lots of questions to be raised around what happened in Israel on October 7th, but you can see the evidence very, very clearly as what's happening in Gaza right now. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Ms. Pitcher. Please, Dr. Gonzalez. We cannot hear you, Dr. Gonzalez. You are muted.
Yeah, sorry, I was muted. I don't want to respond directly to the three questions. I think that I have no difficulty with the facts and figures presented on the televisions and through social media. I tend to think that in today's world, it's difficult to hide these figures. There's what you see there is a hell of a lot of inhumanity, and some may even call it genocide or what. So, but I don't want to deal with that. I don't dispute the figures basically, so I don't want to get into that. I dealt essentially with the question of CARICOM, CARICOM. And I was concerned to what extent there was a lack of proper coordination or common policy. And I was trying to figure out, well, why that was so. And what I labeled two poles. One is ideological, based on a strong political position of principle that you're prepared to defend. And you're prepared to go full length in order to defend that position. So we can see in the case of Belize, where they not only took a strong position, but they were prepared to defend it. They said they're going down the road and they're going to break relations, just like South Africa did, for example. That's a strong position of ideology, where you believe in something. And I was just hinting earlier on, that belief basically came from Said Musa, who was the prime minister before, who has a history of connection with Palestine. And his new president is actually, he was in the government there before with Said Musa. But we won't want to get into that. Belize has that history of taking a very strong position on Israel, and it has defended that position over the years, and I suggest it has cultivated no relations with Israel. Unlike the others that I defined as transactional, I said that basically two of them, Haiti and Jamaica, the two largest countries of CARICOM, they have been wavering a lot with respect to the principled position. Right now, for example, you saw what Jamaica did. You saw there's a whole hullabaloo in Jamaica, but how could the government take that position and so on? And it has over the years defended the Palestinians and so forth. It was well known in the world outside as a defender of the oppressed and so on and so forth. There's a lot of Jamaican people are saying that, and I understand what they're saying, right? Now, I separated those two from the rest, but I also said that the rest are transactional. Because if you take a position that Israel is wrong, Israel is, you're supposed to be able to back it up. And I was pleased to see that Ambassador Comisión was able to answer my question for me when he said that he would have liked to see Barbados take a position like Belize, because this is what, in fact, we were trying. I'm saying you are transactional in the sense that you're making some general statements, but you're not prepared to back it up. When push comes to shove, you're not prepared to back that up, and that is what we mean by transactional. So one CARICOM country goes strongly against Belize, against Israel. Two of them came out very much in favor of Israel, and the rest of them, they are kind of lukewarm in between, and we're not sure. Yes, you support that resolution about stop having a ceasefire and so forth, but we're not sure how far you're prepared to go further on this. So in that sense, I tend to feel that is transactional. That is what I define as transactional. And we're going to see a lot of that CARICOM behavior. Let us be very frank. I don't want to prejudge what may happen on Venezuela. But if the Venezuela thing goes very, very far, we may well see some of that transactional behavior. Because we have seen some of it before when they've dealt with the Americans, when the Americans start to put pressure on them. Hopefully on this occasion, the Americans may be with the Guyanese. But let us not underestimate it, because these countries are looking after their interests. And they tend to believe, we can say all what we want here about being pro-Israel or anti-Israel. They're basically looking at their bottom line. What is their interest here? What is the cost of them giving up, right? Their cooperation with Israel? What does it mean in terms of the impact on jobs, impact of income flows and stuff like that? That is the assessment we're talking about. And that is what we call transactional. Anyway, I'll stop there.
Thank you, Dr. Gonzalez. And now is the turn for Ambassador Commissioning, that I'm sure will have something to say at this point. Please, Ambassador Commissioning.
Yes, thank you. First of all, permit me to say that no CARICOM country has resiled from its solidarity with its member state, Guyana, in terms of the border dispute with Venezuela. It is simply not true. CARICOM has always expressed solidarity and support for its member state, Guyana, in the border dispute. And that has not changed. There's no evidence of any single CARICOM country that has moved away from that position of giving support and solidarity to Venezuela. And mature opinion within CARICOM knows that this is not going to end in any military conflict or anything of that nature. It may be a war of words, but it will not go beyond that. So we know that, all right? Getting back to the issue about Gaza, again, I just want to court statements, because Barbados issued a written statement on the 24th of October. And this is what Barbados had to say about the bombing of Gaza. This is the 24th of October. This is pretty early in the episode. And I'm going to quote, "Even with the best intentions and the most sophisticated weapons, any aerial bombardment in Gaza, an area smaller than Barbados, but with 7 times our own population, is bound to have devastating effects on civilians. The deaths of thousands of Palestinians is testimony to this," end of quote. So the Barbados government was trying to make it clear for the Barbadian people. Barbados is 166 square miles with a population of maybe 300,000 people at the most. Gaza is an area of 140 square miles with a population of over 2 million people. Any aerial bombardment of such a densely packed piece of land, territory, is bound to have devastating effects on the civilian population. And the Israelis know this. This is no secret to them. And that is why Prime Minister Motley subsequently described it as perhaps the first case in world history of a televised genocide. I end there.
Thank you, Ambassador Commission. And now, Dr. Salandi, I would like to remind you that there is a question that was addressed specifically to you. And the question reads, please explain how Israel is apartheid, since you were using this term.
Oh, okay, sure. So I want to start by applauding the very, bold and on-point statement by Barbados. And just to answer the question by a member of the audience, I don't think that apartheid totally captures the situation that is happening in Palestine. But I use the term apartheid because it speaks to a complex system of repression and social control that often involves displacement, it involves segregation, repression, and forcibly removing persons from their land. So we shouldn't be in two minds to see the actions of Israel backed up by dominant Western powers as bringing about certain outcomes that are not in the best interest of people. So whether persons differ as to what it is called, the reality is that people on the ground are suffering from all of the actions of Israel backed up by dominant Western powers.
Okay, I'm going to move now to a second and final round of questions. Again, 3 questions that I have here. The first one is from Shakira Ners, one of the students at the Institute. And these 3 questions are open to all the panelists. So first question coming from Shakira Ners. Israeli police forces have been reportedly arresting Palestinians in Israel who condemn in non-violent terms what is going on in Gaza. Furthermore, the government has also deemed any discourse that criticizes the actions as anti-Semitic. How do you respond to the notion that language and discourse criticizing Israel has also been weaponized? That's the first question. And now I have 2 questions from Professor Byron. The first question from Prof. Byron is the following. Various members of the panel have spoken of the weakness and dysfunctionality of the UN structure at the present time. How might we proceed to some type of reform and reconstruction, and which countries and coalitions might lead the way? And the second question from Professor Byron says, Various panelists have pointed to the divisions among many actors in the international community, including among the EU members and more broadly Western actors. Some actors' responses seems to have been more limited than usual, in addition to the long tradition of support for Israel by the West for a variety of reasons. Has all this given the Israeli government and security forces even more leeway than usual this time around? And that question could be complemented by this third comment also from Professor Byron. And it says, given the fact that there are still over 100 Israeli hostages who have not yet been released and who might be in extreme danger, what might be the impact of the current phase and intensity on the conflict on public opinion in Israel? So again, I'm going to open the floor to all panelists for all of you to react to this final set of questions coming from the audience. I would like to start again by Mr. Hanuman, please.
Hello again. Good evening. The first question about Israeli forces, police forces attacking non-violent protests within Israel. It has to be remembered that although we are hearing and seeing what's happening in Gaza through the social media and through certain media outlets, also on the West Bank, there have been several deaths, several dozen deaths. The Israeli authorities are saying that they're attacking Hamas, but it's not Hamas that's in control of the West Bank. But yet, dozens of civilians have been murdered. And in fact, it's not just Palestinians within Israel or within the occupied territories that are being attacked. I've seen Jewish groups that are opposed to the Gazan war being beaten by police as well. I've seen video footage of this. They've been dragged by their hair, they've been kicked, they've been punched, they've had truncheons used against them. So anybody, it would appear, who oppose the official policy of the Israeli state, which claims to be the only democratic state in the Middle East, which is totally preposterous, they are subject to attack. And also anybody who speaks out against attacks on Palestine are being deemed as terrorists. This young woman, Greta Thunberg, the Swedish environmental activist, she said that the Palestinians have a right to defend themselves, and she was then declared by the Israeli foreign minister to be a supporter of terrorism. Interestingly enough, if the same analogy is used, say, in the Ukraine or to do with the Second World War, where an occupied people defended themselves, people wouldn't see anything wrong with that. I mean, it would be preposterous to say that the Ukrainians don't have a right to defend themselves against Russian occupation, or that the Parisians didn't have a right to defend themselves against Nazi occupation. Of course, an occupied people have every right to defend themselves. In terms of the next question about the UN Security Council, I believe that reform of the Security Council should be part of our demands for reparations when we talk about reparations for slavery and indigenous genocide. Part of the reparations should be reform of the Security Council. That should be one of our rallying cries. We must have it. It's an undemocratic institution. It means really, in effect, that the countries with noted nuclear weapons, and I say noted because obviously Israel has nuclear weapons, but nobody says anything about that. Countries with nuclear weapons, they have a right, in effect, to veto anything that might affect them in any way. The late Muammar Gaddafi said that the biggest terrorists in the world are the countries with the nuclear weapons, and he was absolutely right on that. In terms of the Western governments' support for Israel, I believe a lot of that is coming from anti-Semitism. They don't want the Israeli project to fail because they're concerned that the Jews who are there would return to their countries. And I mentioned earlier the places like the Czech Republic, Poland, the Balkan states, and Hungary. They certainly don't want Jews back in their countries, and that is why they're so rabid in their support for Israel. In terms of the hostage situation, the remaining question, in reality, the people who are being held in Israel as prisoners, Palestinian prisoners, they're also hostages. A lot of them have never been charged with any crime. A lot of them are children, and they've been picked up for allegedly throwing stones and held without trial, even without charge. So they are also hostages in this. And a lot of them as well that have been released as a result of the recent agreement with Hamas have been rearrested. But again, the Western media doesn't say anything about that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hanuman. Please, Dr. Montud, your reactions to this round of questions. Dr. Montud, you have the mic off. You need to, yeah.
Okay,
yes.
Sorry about that. Yeah, I would think that the alliances that, well, the countries are already in groupings based on the, the proposals that they are making for UN reform, for UN Security Council reform. But I think for it to actually happen, they may have to have some compromise and even expanding those alliances. So, for example, the L69 that I spoke about, when you look at the natural allies or the possible allies that could add some weight to align our positions, or at least to subscribe to some of their positions or combine what we are doing with this, probably the group of 4, because they are powerful countries: Brazil, Germany, India, and Japan. I think definitely our allies would not be those who hold the power of the veto. So those countries where there is a possibility of them making inroads in what they are demanding, similar to what the Caribbean countries are saying and other members of that group, would be the allies that could possibly work in terms of moving it forward. Because it has not happened and something else must be done. There needs to be a shift in how we approach it. If we continue to operate in our small enclaves, then we may not get different results. The other thing I want to say about UN Security Council reform and the Caribbean, as I said, that I don't know what some of us may be thinking, that what impact that can we have, because it seems as if it's such a difficult issue. But I think that this is an area that we can take up as a niche area, as Ambassador Commission has said. I'm not sorry, Mr. Hanuman said linked it to reparations. Sorry if I'm mixing it, who said it? I think Mr. Hanuman. We can take it up as a niche area in our diplomacy on the world stage, just as the region became among the most vocal on climate change, for example, being very much impacted by global warming, yet not having contributed to it very much. The region can be among the most loudest voices for reform, as these conflicts affect us disproportionately. So I will end my comments here and leave for someone else to speak.
Thank you, Dr. Montud. Please, Ms. Denise Pitcher.
Yes, thank you. I'd just like to comment into the question with regards to Western support. I mean, Spain has been very vocal in terms of condemning, what Israel's actions in Gaza. But we're also noticing a change in the language with respect to the U.S. government, the defense secretary, or not the defense. I can't remember which U.S. government official. He talked about that Israel may be guilty of committing a strategic defeat in this ongoing slaughter that's happening in Gaza. In this pursuit of getting rid of Gaza and all of the damages, the destruction and loss of life that's happening as a consequence of those actions. And that what might actually result in a strategic defeat, meaning that you're now potentially radicalizing a whole new generation of persons, and that's going to threaten the national security interests of Israel and other Western countries that support Israel actions in Gaza. So while for up until maybe about a week ago, there seems to have been unwavering support by some countries with regards to Israeli actions, language is changing. There are statements that are being made. Even Secretary Blinken, he talked about issuing visa restrictions for persons who are committing any sort of violations in West Bank as well, too, that threaten peace and security in West Bank. So definitely, we need to continue to pay closer attention because the language is definitely changing.
Yes, thank you, Ms. Pitcher. Now, please, Dr. Gonzalez.
Yes, thank you, Dr. LaGuardia. I want to briefly respond to two questions raised by Professor Byron. Before I do so, just let me say that I never said CARICOM is not currently supporting Guyana. What I was saying is that as the problem intensifies and it goes deeper, I'm not sure how much Guyana can count on CARICOM. And let me say very clearly that I'm not sure Guyana is counting on CARICOM. Guyana is counting much more on the powers that be, because CARICOM is not really a big player in this. Okay, when push comes to shove, CARICOM is not a big player. But that's a subject for another debate, and I don't want to go down that road. Professor Byron raised two very, very interesting questions. The first is, how does one explain Israel's audacity, or its arrogance and so on? How does one explain that when you have some declining support for Israel around the world, among NGOs, among some European states? We see Spain and Portugal coming out. How does one explain Israel's, relentless attack and total indifference to the rest of the world? And I think one has to answer that question in terms of the extent to which Israel has grown in power over the years. Israel has become almost like a superpower. Israel has nuclear weapons. Israel has a Jewish state that comprises Jews all over the world, which is broader than the state of Israel. And the power that they have accumulated, they feel they can take on the world. They have defeated the Arab countries since 1949, when they first established here. And there's no way the Arab countries are prepared to take them on. You look at how the Arab countries are behaving. They are reluctant. Egypt was the last one to decide, look, they don't want to take on Israel here. They want to settle the thing. Well, the Palestinian situation is bad. We can't do anything more about that. And, but we want to preserve Egypt as a state. We don't want to get in there and fight with Israel because we can't take on Israel. The only country that's probably challenging Israel is Iran. And, I'm not sure even if Iran wants an outright war with Israel. So what I'm basically saying is that Israel has grown tremendously in power, and the United States has assisted it a lot to become like that by supplying it with a lot of weapons and stuff like that, to the point where Israel feels confident it can take on the whole of the Middle East, if not the world. The second point, which I think that, and it relates to some extent to the point about the Security Council. I am concerned I can't really see how you could reform the Security Council to deal with this problem. Because from the time a state has nuclear weapons, it is very difficult for the Security Council to deal with that particular state. We see it with Russia and in the Ukraine. Right? And we know that security reform is on the agenda, and that there's talk about bringing in Brazil, bringing in Japan, bringing in Germany, and probably one or two others, India, and so forth. And I'm saying that is good, and I welcome that security reform, and that it could help us probably solve some problems in the world. But that will not solve the problem with Israel and Palestine. Israel is not going to listen to any of those countries who come in there, and you will still have that division in the world. If the United States position isn't changed, and the United States remains behind Israel, we're going to have the same position. The American veto is going to be there, and the Americans will continue to back Israel. So I'm not sure exactly how security reform could tackle what is in front of us. You probably need a radical change in the world, way down the road, which I'm not seeing. But at current right now, I can't see exactly how UN reform, which is needed. I admit we need security reform for other purposes, but I can't see basically how it can deal with this particular problem. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Gonzalez. Please, Ambassador Commission.
Yes, thank you. The whole world is watching an evil, inhuman, televised genocide. And the people of the South, the Black and brown nations and people of the world, are aghast that powerful Western countries are giving moral support to Israel, are giving arms and ammunition to Israel. And people's eyes are opening up. And what is being played out in front of us is something that is not going to be easily forgotten or forgiven. Fortunately for some of these Western countries, you have, for example, in the UK, I was present for the march. 500,000 people marched through, 500,000 British people marched through the streets of London in solidarity with the Palestinian people and demanding a ceasefire. But what about the elites? What about the political elites, the governments? And I think what is happening, precisely because it is being televised and it is sinking into the consciousness of masses of people all over the global South, is going to precipitate a turning point in world affairs. But let me leave that there. The UN Security Council. When we talk about reform of the UN Security Council, first and foremost, we are talking about the removal of the veto. The veto is an anachronism. It goes back to the allies in the Second World War, the victorious allies who established the United Nations and gave themselves this great privilege, which is no longer relevant or constructive. In fact, it is unconstructive in this 21st century world that we are living in. Permit me to also say that CARICOM is already involved in Security Council reform. In fact, it has efforts have been going on for some years now. Admittedly, it is a very difficult process. But I think what has not been appreciated by many people is that there's a new spirit. There is a new spirit animating the leadership of CARICOM. Something happened in CARICOM when in 2013 that reparations campaign was launched. That reparations idea and logic, that a historical injustice has been done, and that because of that injustice, we are entitled to make demands. We are entitled to demand the reform and restructuring of institutions of a world order. We are entitled to demand compensation and to be heard. That ethic is animating not only the reparations campaign per se, but that is feeding into things like the campaign for climate justice. That is feeding into things like the demand that the international financial institutions must be reformed. That is underpinning initiatives like the Bridgetown Initiative. So let me be very clear. Right now, via the Bridgetown Initiative, via CARICOM's reparations campaign, CARICOM is already making demands that this structurally unjust world order has to be reformed, has to be restructured. CARICOM and CARICOM leaders like Prime Minister Motley, forgive me for calling her name perhaps too much, but we're arguing that the G20 cannot remain a group of 20 powerful nations without the inclusion of Africa, without the inclusion of the African Union. And what did we see this year? Well, there's no longer a G20, there's now a G21. The African Union is included. And similarly, we are making demands of reforms in the World Bank, the IMF, the United Nations, and it is only going to get stronger and more insistent from here onwards. So I am saying we need to pay attention to this. Yes, you could be very critical of the fact that for much of our history, I'm speaking of CARICOM now, we were too accommodating to these Western powers, but I'm saying that has begun to turn around, and there is a new spirit animating our political leadership, and we are now making demands that we were not making a few years before. Thank you.
Yes, Ambassador, there is a question specifically for you. So very briefly, could you, to the best of your knowledge, this is a question by Neil Maharaj. To the best of your knowledge, are any CARICOM countries considering giving asylum to refugees? It's a discussion taking place in Trinidad. Or on a more general note, I genuinely appreciate all the panelists and this discussion. Well, this is a comment by Neil Maharaj. And just a quick word, if you know what is going on about considering asylum to refugees, Ambassador Commissioner.
I wonder, refugees from where? I mean, Trinidad has done very well. I'm not sure if we will call them refugees, but they have taken in Venezuelans, you know, who for whatever reason wanted to leave Venezuela, and Trinidad has really done tremendously well in hosting, you know, several thousands of people. But which refugees? Refugees from? I'm not sure. I'm not sure about the question. I'm a little bit. I'm a little bit uncertain as to which refugees are we talking about. Of course, every mature member of the international community, and I would hope that CARICOM nations, some of which are 60 years old at this point in time, that we consider ourselves mature members of the international community, and that we would step up to our responsibility to accept refugees. Of course, within the constraints of our resources. But yes, I would hope. I'm not sure that this is a matter that has been discussed in CARICOM. I haven't heard the discussion if it took place, but I would hope that we would be mature and accept refugees within the limits of our constraints as small countries.
Okay, thank you. I will invite now Dr. Salandi, and after that, we will have a final brief round for interventions again for all panelists with 2 remaining questions. So please, Dr. Salandi.
Thank you. I want to applaud and support the comments by Mr. Hanuman about including these structural reforms as part of the reparations package. And I want to also really applaud the comments by the ambassador about not just reforming the UN Security Council, but all of these other so-called international agencies that have this aura of being democratic. All of them need to be deeply reformed and deeply changed. One of the challenges of the reparations agenda and the move for Caribbean countries to be on the side of justice is the fact that I don't think that Caribbean leaders have really gone to the best lengths possible to achieve justice in the scope of choices that they have under their control within their own country. So it's one thing to be calling for and trying to bring about changes in the global world system that we have less control of, when many of the choices to decolonize and to structurally change the nature of our society hasn't yet properly gone the lens that it could have gone. So I'm generally not very satisfied with some of the choices, especially in my own country, in terms of the lens that the government has gone to recognize justice within their own choices. Secondly, the other challenge in terms of reform lies in the limited geopolitical power that the Caribbean wields. So as much as we may have a voice, we may have certain interests and certain ideas, we are just a mere dot on the map and often very marginal in the processes of the global world system. And I think that sometimes the Caribbean's own choices lends itself to that reality. So why in this day and age many ex-British colonies in the Caribbean still a part of the Commonwealth of Nations? Where is our Global South organization, our Global South fraternity, by which we could discuss and forward agendas that are central to our interests as Global South people? So I think that it's important that we shouldn't be arguing or celebrating any seat at the table, any seat at the UN Security Council, but more so arguing and, or rather advocating and strategizing for deeper changes within all of these institutions that call themselves global and call themselves international, when the constitution and outcomes are far from that. And finally, I want to say that as much as we may have limited opportunities to affect the type of change we want in the global world system, a lot of these global hotspot issues have deep lessons for us as Caribbean people, because they reflect deeper things that we have not addressed in our own societies. The ongoing legacies of empire and colonialism are still deeply enshrined in our laws, in our education system, in the operations of mainstream media, in terms of how people do relationships, children, family, life, nature, the environment. So there's still a way for us to go to clean up our acts and to clean up our structures so that there could be healthier and better outcomes for us all. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Salandi. I'm now going to read the two final questions and give all the panelists to react and also to add final comments. We are running out of time, so next round, please, each panelist takes up to 3 minutes to make your final reactions and comments. Well, the first question of the two remaining on the chat is from Rachel Weiss-Masson, and she says, great discussion from all panelists. I was hoping that we would have a best shown both Palestine and Israeli perspective on the conflict and how they contribute to CARICOM stand. We have had explicit information on the conflict from Palestine point of view, so I would like to hear the panelists take from Israel's point of view. I would have liked to hear conversations on how Israel sending warnings to Palestinians to evacuate potential bombing sites, which seems counterintuitive with dealing with Hamas, is classed as genocide. The contribution of Hamas also preventing civilians from evacuating, and its contribution to the death toll of Palestinians would have completed the conversations. I would have also liked to hear more about Hamas establishing military-based networks near hospitals and schools, which also breaches humanitarian laws, and how that shifts the asymmetric nature of this war. How do these circumstances contribute to the stand CARICOM has taken in this conflict? And the second question coming from Ricardo Mitchell, he says, considering Middle Eastern countries' failure to invite Palestinian refugees, is this panel of the opinion that the Caribbean should extend humanitarian aid or leverage our relationship with or definitely lobby Middle Eastern nations to accept refugees? Thank you all for your time and valuable insights. So with these two questions and any other comment, we will finish this question and answer segment. So again, now I would like to go to reverse the order of engagement so we can bring also more dynamism to intervention. So now let us invite first Dr. Salandi, please. So we will start with Dr. Salandi and we'll move backwards.
Okay, so I was caught off guard.
I'm sorry for that. But you are always on guard, Dr. Salandi, so please go ahead.
No problem at all. I would like to disagree with the point of view expressed that at least my view was represented some Palestinian point of view. I don't think that if a person articulates a particular view in the interest of justice and in the interest of understanding the roots of a cause, that you are necessarily, expressing a view coming from one particular side. I have studied closely this conflict over the years and looked at both perspectives, both coming from Palestine and Israel. And I wouldn't say that my view is a Palestinian one, but I think that we need to understand the symmetry of the situation and understand that there's a power imbalance. Most of the operations of international organizations have not been on the side of justice in that situation. The mainstream media, most of the views that we have gotten have not been biased on the side of Palestinians. It has been quite the opposite. So I don't think that, we could easily just be neutral and objective and represent both sides. Of course, we would want to be balanced. we would want to hear both sides, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we have to take that sort of stance. So in closing, I just want to say that this issue is extremely important for us understanding how do we perceive and interpret it, and interpret when you have hostilities and conflicts happening in various parts of the world. And we have to understand that there's a propaganda war that is just as devious and as just as damaging as the so-called war on the ground. And so being able to make sense of what is happening on the ground is one of the biggest outcomes that we could take away from what is happening, as much as we may not be able to directly affect a lot of things because it may be outside of our geopolitical control.
Thank you, Dr. Salandi. Now, please, Ambassador Commission.
I would like to point out that when this thing first emerged on the 7th of October with the Hamas attack on Israel, within 2 days, CARICOM issued a statement, and the CARICOM statement was very even-handed. This is what it said. The Caribbean community abhors the attacks in Israel and the counterattacks in the Palestinian territory of Gaza. Innocent lives are being lost amidst the fervor and violence of the actual combatants. CARICOM thus joins the responsible members of the international community in calling for an immediate ceasefire and end of hostilities by all parties. The recent round of hostilities reflects the pain and suffering of ancient quarrels, the ongoing harsh conditions under which the Palestinians live in veritable colonialism, and Israel's sense of security will contribute to a cycle of violence until those realities are definitively addressed. End of quote. So very even-handed. That's the 9th of October. But as the weeks went on, and we began to see the horror, the barbarity of relentless Israeli bombardment, killing children, women, men, you began to see the change in the tone of the statements, because people began to be horrified by what they were seeing unfolding before their very eyes. And so any responsible member of the international community now is not about even-handedness and balance. It is about stopping genocide. That is the urgent matter of the moment. How do we stop the genocide that is taking place in Gaza? And that is what we should all be turning our attention to. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Commissioning. Dr. Gonzalez, please.
Yes. Well, first of all, I wanted to deal with the general question about the changes in world order. I think that's a question has been raised about the extent to which, we are seeing the death of neocolonialism and the world is changing. And I think if you look at what's happening out there, it is clear to me that the United States has declined substantially in power. We see this in the region. If you see what's happening in this region today, you clearly see that the United States doesn't have the power to impose its will in this region as compared to years ago. A lot of regimes would not have been able to exist in this regime today if it was like what it was back in the days of the 60s, 70s, and the 80s. The United States has had to withdraw from Afghanistan. It has had to come out of Iraq and Syria. It has lost its position a lot in the Middle East, and it is, while it has a substantive amount of power, and one shouldn't underestimate it, it has how many? 700, I can't remember the exact figure right now, but probably over 120, probably much more bases around the world, and it can still project power. So one still has to deal with that, right? And we still know that American influence is something that you can't simply write off. But the world is changing, and we see the rise of powers now, middle powers and certain superpowers. We see the rise of China. We see the rise of a lot of powers in the Middle East, regional powers, Iran and even United Arab Emirates and so forth. And they're having influence all around them, Turkey and so forth now, all around the Middle East and so forth. In the Caribbean here, for example, we've seen states doing things that they never did before. We can tell the United States, look, we want to deal with China and you can't do anything about it, and they go ahead. The Dominican Republic has changed, Panama has changed, and the Americans can't do anything about it. So the world has changed. So I think we have to, in a sense, begin to recognize that the world is changing and there's a call for a change in the management of the world. The whole idea of the BRICS and so on, and the BRICS incorporating a whole lot of new countries is to some extent to weaken the US dollar and to change the whole governance of the international financial order and generally the world order. So that is changing. It will take some time. Again, we're not there as yet, but it's in a process of change. So I first wanted to deal with that issue because it's coming up all the time, and I think I needed to add some degree of clarity to it. There's the other issue that occurred. Someone asked about refugees. I think that is the question about what do we say about refugees. I think we have to understand that it's hard for those Middle East countries. They have taken in so many Palestinians over the years. Jordan, Lebanon, Iran, Egypt, all of them have taken them in. And when the Palestinians come, they create problems for these countries. You have not only to find a place for them and provide shelter and schooling and health and all of these sort of things, but the Palestinians create conflicts in these places. When they come, they even go against, I think it was in the case of the Lebanon government, they went against the Lebanese government and they even attacked the Lebanese government that was there, the Christian government that was there at the time and so forth. And this is the reason why Egypt is refusing to accept more, because they have accepted some, but they're refusing to accept more Palestinian refugees in the Sinai. The whole aim of Israel in this conflict is to drive the 2 million people in Gaza across that border into Sinai. That is what Israel is basically trying to do, and get rid of the problem. Drive them across it and get Egypt to accept them. And let them settle in the Sinai and get rid of them that way. Egypt is saying, no, we are not accepting that, and I fully agree with Egypt. I've been to that part of the world, and I've seen the circumstances there and so forth, and I could tell you the hell that they would create for Egypt if they come across that border and settle there and begin to perpetuate a war for Egypt. Egypt doesn't see that in its interest. It supports the Palestinians, and it helps as much as it could, but it's not going to take on that burden which could destroy Egypt. When they come there, they're going to, because there are already forces in the Sinai which tend to go against Egypt, the government in Egypt. They will probably collaborate with them to try to overthrow the government in Cairo and so forth. But the point about it is that one has to understand the burden to those Arab countries over the years. Since even before 1949, they have been accepting refugees. And you go there today, all those refugees, most of them are living in slums, conditions are degraded, and they're struggling to come out of it and so forth. So one, in a sense, has to feel sorry for them. If they don't want to take any more, I could understand that they're overburdened. Whether the Caribbean can do something more, can take in some of them, but that's an interesting question one can ask. Maybe we can give a little more humanitarian aid. I agree with that. We can probably do a little more there and so forth. But it's a very complex problem, and I think it's not easy, something that we could easily answer here. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Gonzalez. Please, Ms. Denise Pitcher, it's your turn now.
Thank you. So I'd like to address the issue on refugees. Any state as a party to the Refugee Convention has an obligation to allow persons to seek asylum. So Trinidad and Tobago is a party to the Refugee Convention. If we do receive persons from Gaza, Palestinian people, who declare an intent to seek asylum, we do have that obligation, and any other state who is a party to the Refugee Convention. With regards to Venezuelan asylum seekers and refugees, yes, we do have asylum seekers and refugees from Venezuela. They're not all economic migrants. They are fleeing human rights violations. They are fleeing political persecution. So yes, we do have asylum seekers and refugees from Venezuela. With respect to the comment about military bases close to hospitals in Gaza, to date, the Israeli government has not provided any evidence with regards to any military installations, military bases close to hospitals. The tunnels were actually constructed by the Israeli government in the 1980s. So those videos of the tunnels that you see on social media, that was done by the Israeli government. And there was videos released by the Israeli government when they went into Al-Shifa and to other hospitals, and they took videos, and it was actually, I mean, there's no other words to describe it, but comical. It was comedy, what they were trying to demonstrate in terms of supposed terrorist bases under these hospitals. There was one more comment as well. So I'm forgetting what it is. It's refugees. Oh, and then they also talked about the fact that the Israeli government notified Palestinians ahead of time to flee. Where were they supposed to go? When they were fleeing, yes, they were notified, and as they were leaving hospitals or other places, they were shot at in these streets. They were waving white flags, and they were being shot at. So, and where were they supposed to flee? They're blockaded from every single point. So again, no, these are all disinformation. This is why we have to be so careful about what we share and what we see on social media, because there is a lot of misinformation and disinformation. We need to be very, very critical about how we assess information on social media. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Pitcher. Please, Dr. Montut.
Yes, thank you, Chair. I just want to say thanks to all the panelists. You know, I have heard some very good points from every single one of them, and I want to just make comments on one or two, and that is the fact that I think that we need to give greater agency to the Caribbean. You know, the Caribbean, we do not have the economic might, but I think that we have, you know, as the cliche goes, we have been known to punch above our weights, the weight of our ideas. You see, we don't have the military might, but we have minds, and we have a history of practicing very good diplomacy and having that sort of respect on the international stage. And I think, as Ambassador Commission said, you know, this is, I like the word, you know, the spirit of the moment, that term, that a lot is happening, and, you know, combined with the leadership of CARICOM and the new ethos, that there is a space now, there is a moment where we can move forward with all of those things that are happening, and they're all interconnected. So I am very hopeful. I'm very hopeful. It will be long, it will be difficult, but if we stick to the task and we are on the side of justice, I think that we cannot go wrong, even if, you know, there are shortcomings or we don't get to the full length that we want to go. I think the Caribbean needs to be known, continue to be known in those terms, and continue to be seen. Our legacy needs to be that. The way we are viewed on the international stage needs to be that. So it's not about who is right or who's wrong or who we are pleasing, but if we are known to stand up for certain things, and we are, you know, to exercise our agency in different situations, as have been highlighted, I think this would be good for the Caribbean. And lastly, I want to say that at the end of the day, although we want to point fingers as who's right and wrong, the main thing we want to do is to promote and advance international peace and security. And therefore, there will have to be compromises. And it is definitely not going to happen with more weapons. It's definitely not going to happen with more bombs, and definitely not more of hate. We need a different model. And I think this is where we can come in to advocate what is the model going forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Montut. And for closing this round and panelist intervention, Mr. Hanuman, please.
Hello again. Yes. The Zionists like to conflate opposition to Israel with anti-Semitism. They say if you criticize Israel, you're anti-Semitic. They like to conflate. I would like to just quote from two Jewish people. One is the anti-Zionist Rabbi Zalman Teitelbaum, and in referring to Israel and Zionism, this is what he said: "There's never been such a sect that caused so much damage to the Jewish people." And he's absolutely correct. The most anti-Semitic entity in this earth of ours is the State of Israel. They are the most anti-Semitic entity. Hamas cannot equate with their anti-Semitism. In terms of another quote, there's this guy called Gabor Mate. He's a Jewish Holocaust survivor. So what he says, I believe, ought to have considerable weight. He says, take the worst thing that you can say about Hamas, multiply it by 1,000, and it still will not meet the Israeli repression, the Israeli killing, and the Israeli dispossession of the Palestinians. And I think both of those quotes are very important. The issue of Israel's point of view, there was an interview with one of the former prime ministers of Israel, and he was chastising the Western media for being objective in reporting what is happening currently in Gaza. He was saying you should not be objective, because he says if you are objective, you are in effect supporting terrorism. That is what he said on the BBC, I seem to recall it was, yeah? The issue of warnings. Hamas has been warning Israel since its very inception, and as has been pointed out earlier by another speaker, Hamas was the creation of the State of Israel. The Times of Israel is on record as saying that. There was a brass tacks program here in Barbados, and a IDF officer, colonel, she actually admitted that the State of Israel created Hamas, and they funded Hamas, and they did it deliberately to divide and rule, to create a schism between the PLO and in effect Hamas. But Hamas has been warning Israel since its inception that it will take a position against Israel. So this issue of warnings, to use that sort of argument is to justify, in effect, Hamas's attack on the 7th of October, because Hamas has warned that it will attack Israel. So if Israel is saying that we're okay to murder 16,000 civilians because we issued a warning that we're going to murder them, then that is the very same argument put forward by Hamas. Israel is using Hamas argument to justify the murder of 16,000 civilians. And in fact, in terms of this using of hospitals as a military base, that has been debunked by Miss Denise Pitcher. But as Mr. Commission has pointed out, Israel is only Gaza is only 140.9 square miles. Anywhere you put a military base is a civilian area. There's nowhere else to put a military base but in a civilian area. And in terms of the refugees issues, it would be ridiculous for the Arab countries, which are anyway puppets of the West, they all are. They nowhere represent what their people stand for. The people in these Arab countries are firmly behind the Palestinians, but their leaderships are all Western designated puppets. You have to remember that Sisi was installed in power by the Americans. He murdered the former president, Morsi, who would have been taking certainly a different position today had he been president. But to allow refugees in would be to never allow them back into Gaza, because that, as Dr. Anthony Gonzalez pointed out, is the objective of the Israelis, to get rid of the Palestinians, to chase them out. And once they're out, they're never let back in. Any Jew from any part of the world has a right of return, as it's called, despite the fact that they were absent for 2,000 years, the right of return to Israel. But Palestinians who were kicked out in a Nakba in 1948, and they're there in their millions in Syria and Lebanon and Jordan, etc., are not allowed back in. I hear interviews on the World Service with IDF spokespeople, and I'm hearing Scottish accents, I'm hearing French accents, I'm hearing English accents. These are people who have just migrated to Israel, and they have every right to, under the Jewish right of return racist policy. And that's, I think, a good example of the apartheid system that has been alluded to. They have every right under the laws of Israel to live there. But the Palestinians who've been living there for 2,000 years are in refugee camps all over the world. So yes, I'm opposed to the granting of refugee status to Palestinians by Egypt, etc. Their land is Palestine, and they have every right to be there in Gaza. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Hanuman, and I would like to thank again all panelists for your intervention and the answers that you have shared. Before inviting Mr. Isidore to concluding remarks and closing, I would like also to acknowledge the presence as part of the attendees of Ms. Ana Lorna, Head of the Department of Extra-Regional Integration of the Vice Ministry of Multilateral Foreign Policy. She attended on behalf of the Foreign Minister, Roberto Alvarez, Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Dominican Republic. I would like to emphasize that this was an open webinar, so anyone that was interested on joining us and sharing your questions and comments had the opportunity to do so. And this is and that will be the policy of the Institute of International Relations of the West Indies. So please follow us on social media and you will have the opportunity to join us in future events. We will be more than pleased to have you and give everyone the opportunity to interact with us. So I would like to invite now Mr. David Isidore for the concluding remarks and the vote of thanks.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair, Dr. LaGuardia. Wow, we had such an interesting and in-depth and very rich discussion with our panelists. So I would just give a few remarks and then I would give the vote of thanks. I would like to really just jump off of what Dr. Montout's last statement was. She said the need for a different model. And I think that's the kind of main message that was echoed throughout all the panelists, the need for the different model. And we had Ambassador Commission really speaking from the CARICOM's perspective, saying that we have been advocating for that reform, have advocated for the expansion of the G7, of the G20, and the reform within the UN Security Council. So I'd just like to begin by just going through each panelist's main points. We began with Professor Griffith, who gave that introduction, and he kind of set the playing field and what we're looking at. And he said that he spoke about the interconnectivity of the world and the impact of conflicts and all conflicts on the Caribbean. We began with Dr. Hanuman, who really gave us and laid that historical foundation. And he said a really interesting kind of impactful line. He said the UN created the condition for this global conflict. And then we saw each panelist kind of building upon that. Dr. Montout spoke about the international structure, particularly within UN, and the impact of the Security Council and the fact that we had the failure of the UN and its structures, particularly within that Security Council and the Permanent Five, really emphasizing the need for reform and bringing the point of the Caribbean perspective. Dr. Montout mentioned and quoted the Deputy Permanent Representative of St. Vincent to the UN, who spoke loudly and proudly to the General Assembly on the issue and on the need for reform. We had Ms. Pitcher giving the humanitarian perspective, looking at the impact of the conflict on the humanitarian struggle within Palestine. She also echoed the same sentiments of Dr. Montout, emphasizing the failure of the Security Council. Dr. Gonzalez really brought into the forefront the Caribbean impact or the Caribbean response. And he used a lot the word transactional. And Dr. Gonzalez really allowed us to think. He said that the Caribbean governments are more transactional within their response. And this can really be and he was stating very clearly that states not necessarily having a very clear position or being as outright. And he gave the example of Belize. So he really introduced us and he got us really thinking. Ambassador Commission followed and he added, and he kind of clarified, echoing similar sentiments, Belize, and quoting Belize's position on the Israel-Palestine position, conflict, but he made sure and clarified, he said that the position of Belize is not far from the statements posted by CARICOM. And he quoted in depth or gave us a portion of the speech of the Prime Minister of Barbados, the Honorable Mia Mottley, who acknowledged the horrible attack by Hamas, but also denounced the attack of Palestine and in general, because it's not just the Gaza, but the attack on Palestine by Israel, the proportional attack. And then we had Dr. Salandi, who I thought really gave an interesting thing. He said that the Caribbean place in a hostile world, and that kind of summarized for me, because it looked at the linkages between. He spoke about imperial power. He gave a bit of a historical context, and he spoke about that imperial power and the Caribbean's place within that imperial history, and that what the Caribbean needs is to rethink the issue of justice, the issue of justice unyoked from that present binding world power, world order. So we had all of the discussions kind of piling on each other, expanding on each other. But at the end of the day, what we are taking away from this is a real need for reform within international organizations and within the international structures. And we were also shown that CARICOM, the Caribbean countries, are leading in that. The ambassador mentioned that in theory, so in the CARICOM, we're supposed to have a more or less united foreign policy. Well, we're kind of taking that. We see that with the mention of the deputy permanent representative of St. Vincent to the UN. We see that with the Honorable Prime Minister Mia Mottley and her statements. We see that with Belize. We see that with Trinidad and Tobago. We see that all over. We have that united front, and that is very important. It's important, and that's kind of what we're taking out. We're taking out the fact that the Caribbean has made its position clear, and the Caribbean is also championing and voicing its concerns and the need for reform within the international system, because without reform, problems would continue to arise and exist, such as the conflict. So we'd like to thank Dr. Anita Montoots, the interim director of the Institute of International Relations of the University of the West Indies. We'd like to thank Professor Griffith, fellow and Caribbean Policy Consortium of organizing this timely seminar. We want to thank the marketing and communications for putting together the Zoom and putting together and making sure that you here were able to be notified and were able to join this Zoom. We'd like to thank the panelists from beginning all the way with Mr. Hanuman, Dr. Montoot, Ms. Pitcher, Dr. Gonzalez, Ambassador Commission, and Dr. Salandi. We'd like to give a special thanks to the chairperson for this evening's events, Dr. LaGuardia, the Institute of International Relations staff, for their time and dedication towards the event. We'd like to give special thanks to Ambassador Cordero. We graciously thank you for attending and for taking the time to participate in this evening's seminar. We'd also like to thank the Honorable Minister Alva Batiste, Minister of Foreign Affairs of St. Lucia, and thank Ms. Anna Lorena, Head of Department of Extra-Regional Integration of the Vice Ministry of Multilateral Foreign Policy, who attended on behalf of the Foreign Minister, Minister Alberto Alvarez, Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Dominican Republic. And finally, and last but not least, we'd like to thank the participants for your rich contribution. The chat box was full of insightful takes, was full of insightful perspectives, and dynamic questions that really had us thinking, that got us to the root and the main essence of this discussion, looking at the Caribbean, looking at Israel, looking at Palestine, looking at possible solutions, and looking at the problems and possible solutions of how we can take it. So thank you again to everyone for being here with us, and we'd like to wish you all the best and a good night.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Ms. Isidore. And again, everyone has a pleasant evening. Thank you for your contributions, and see you on next events organized by the Institute of International Relations together with the Caribbean Policy Consortium. So thanks, everyone. Good night.